Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
It is Friday on the Three Martini Lunch. We'd like to say happy Friday, but if you're paying attention to what's happening in Minnesota, not a lot to smile about right now. Hopefully things will get better as the National Guard moves in. Last night, very, very difficult, but your stool awaits. We still have a lot to talk about. There's a lot of important things to talk about today, and so let's do that. We have 4 bad martinis on the Three Martini Lunch. That's just how rough of an evening it was, Jim, and we're really not even getting to the fact that 7 people were shot in Louisville last night due to another massive protest over a police-involved killing back in March with Breonna Taylor. So this is going to focus mainly on Minnesota, but let's get to it. I mean, last night, if you watched even from fairly normal waking hours, 10 o'clock East Coast time, up to midnight certainly, you saw things devolving in real time there in Minnesota. The fires were started in a number of locations pretty early on. There was even still some glimmers of daylight going on. For a while there, the police were tossing flashbang grenades off the 3rd precinct. Ultimately, they decided that it wasn't worth staying there, so they pulled back and really pulled back from the entire neighborhood. So the precinct burned, a number of different businesses burned. A former church friend of ours who now lives in Minnesota, Facebook posted this out from a local neighborhood association. It's called the Midtown Phillips Neighborhood Association. Our neighborhood was destroyed last night by folks not from Phillips and maybe not even the South Side. We have lost hundreds of jobs in this economic hard time. Businesses were struggling to survive, and now this extra burden was added. No place to get groceries, no place to get prescriptions, no place to get supplies or clothes or greeting cards or sanitizer or cleaning supplies. Many with no car. And let's not forget we're in a pandemic with all these strangers invading our neighborhood. And then the last line, Jim, which is pretty hard to deny, quote, "We were abandoned by city leadership and left to burn." And, that's pretty much obviously what happened last night. As the night went on, it got worse and worse. But even with fires blazing behind him, Ali Velshi of MSNBC had the gall to say this.
I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started.
So, Jim, I guess he's going to get the media's Chip Diller Award, but I don't know how else you see last night as anything other than a disgrace and doing nothing to help get justice for George Floyd.
Yeah, it feels like we are trapped in this domino falling sequence in which every reaction to each preceding bad thing makes the situation worse. The original police killing does not feel justifiable by any stretch of the imagination. This was not a person who was wanted on violent crimes. He was completely under control. There were 4 police officers. He was on the ground. This was not a high-speed chase. This was not a split-second decision that a cop had to make in a tense situation. None of the traditional explanations fit in this case. And this is obviously, it's very understandable. People would be outraged about this. People would be furious about this. Rioting is clearly not the answer. And then, it feels like a lifetime ago, Ali Velshi and I had a not so friendly exchange on CNN at the time. He was at CNN at the time, and he just flipped out on me on air. And I've never thought terribly well of him since that. At that moment, he turned into the "this is fine" dog from the meme that spreads around quite a bit. Basically, insist or put in you mentioned Chip Diller. The image of Frank Drebin as the explosions of the fireworks factory behind him, insisting there's nothing to see here. I mean, he lived down to every stereotype of the media, trying to tell you something when what is going on directly behind him completely contradicts what he is saying. And I think now, look, he's in a bad situation in the streets in that moment. Things are burning around. It is a tense situation. We know that there's violence going on. So I'm going to show Ali Velshi a molecule or two of sympathy and to say, look, I understand you're in very tough situations like that. Having said that, anybody who walks around believing that the media lies, that the media is not honest, that the media tries to make excuses for inexcusable behavior by looters and rioters and things like that, is just going to point to that as Exhibit A to say, look, even when it's happening right in front of us on camera, they're going to insist that it's not really happening. And I think there's legitimacy to that criticism.
Jim, you used the word rioters. I saw yesterday that NBC has decided that they're not going to use that term. So whatever you want to describe what we've seen over the past couple of days, apparently it's not rioting in the eyes of NBC, and maybe he's trying to back up that policy. I'm sure he's trying to say that not everybody is setting things on fire, and I'm sure that's true. But I don't know that there were a ton of people out there trying to stop them from doing that. It seemed like more people were there for fascination and just to see what would happen rather than do any sort of organized protesting on principle or anything else. Last night was just kind of a free-for-all, and it was just ugly in every single way. And it reminded me a lot of Baltimore when the mayor there at the time, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, basically told police, give them room to destroy or something to that effect. And that's pretty much what happened in that neighborhood last night.
It did. And there's going to be quite a bit of blame to go around. As I said, it seems like each decision makes the situation worse. And we'll talk a bit about other bad police decisions, but you start looking and wondering, did the elected officials in charge of public security of those residents in those communities metaphorically abandon their posts? Maybe you could argue literally abandon their posts when they decided not to defend the police station. Were they afraid of saying, no, you can't set that fire here. You can't take that from this business. You can't destroy that. That in some ways, do they flinch in the face of bullies? And that, they should not be the least bit surprised that when they do that, a bad situation gets much worse very quickly.
As day turned to evening in Minnesota yesterday, I think a lot of us had a premonition that it was going to be bad, not only because of what we had seen the previous night or maybe even two nights, but because of what we saw yesterday afternoon, where Hennepin County prosecutor Mike Freeman was asked, why aren't there any charges yet against these officers? We all saw the video. Now there's more video showing that there are actually, I think, 2 or 3 police officers kneeling on George Floyd, only one of them on his neck, which is obviously the most significant one. But here was his answer as to why no charges yet.
I will say this, that video is graphic and horrific and terrible, and no person should do that. But my job in the end is to prove that he violated a criminal statute. And there is other evidence that does not support a criminal charge. We need to wade through all of that evidence and to come through with a meaningful determination, and we are doing that to the best of our ability.
So, Jim, to see that video and then to see Freeman say, well, we got some evidence that looks really bad and other stuff, maybe not a crime here. Not hard to see why folks would react poorly to that. Doesn't excuse anything, but it doesn't tamp down the frustration when the prosecutor can look at that and suggest that maybe there's no charges coming in.
Yeah, I'm sitting there thinking, on the first glance, this seems idiotic. On the other hand, I believe the officer who shot Philando Castile was acquitted of manslaughter and other associated charges. So I suppose you could make the argument, we're taking this very seriously. We want to have all of our I's dotted, all of our T's crossed. We know that this is going to be one of the most scrutinized prosecutions that this office ever brings if we choose to go ahead with this. And we can't afford to make a mistake. You could maybe buy yourself a little time with an explanation like that. But for the person whose job is to hold the police accountable, looking at that video and saying, yeah, I'm not sure there's a crime there. Again, this does not justify rioting. This does not justify doing any damage to anybody else's property. This does not justify violence. But it is very easy to understand why so many Minnesotans of all colors would be outraged by the mentality that is at work in their law enforcement and prosecutorial communities.
Absolutely right. And Mitch McConnell, who was obviously watching what's going on in his hometown of Louisville with the 7 people shot there in reaction to the Breonna Taylor case, is saying, look, I understand the anger. It doesn't excuse what's going on here, but there is justified anger here, and that has to be dealt with in a way where justice is provided. So I think that was a pretty good message in the moment there. And so, Jim, I think some folks, if this case is looked at very carefully, might not be happy with what charges ultimately come forward. If there are charges, I could see maybe a manslaughter, even involuntary manslaughter could be coming forward here, even though people were screaming at the officer, he can't breathe and everything. So if it's not a murder charge, on some level, you're probably going to get a lot of protests to that. But the idea that there's no charge here seems completely implausible. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the George Zimmerman case down in Florida, one of the interesting arguments was that by going after the most serious criminal charge that the prosecutors could make, Zimmerman was found not guilty by the jury. And did the prosecutor make the job harder for themselves? Could you have charged him with a lesser charge? And not only is the possibility of a plea deal, at some point, then they eventually start to arise in that situation. There's a lesser standard of evidence. It's not as difficult to get a jury to send somebody to jail if they feel like they're not being overcharged and that this isn't some sort of symbolic prosecution. So, in a legal sense, there may be a justification for that. And if you're rioting because somebody gets charged with, say, aggravated manslaughter instead of murder, well, first of all, if you're rioting, don't do it. But secondly, you probably think maybe there's a point. Maybe the prosecutors want to make sure this guy goes to jail, and they've decided this is the best opportunity or the best path forward to pursue that goal. But from just the general tone of this prosecutor, it is not hard to see why people are losing faith in this institution very quickly.
We also got another little nugget yesterday on this similar thread, Jim, because while Mike Freeman is the current Hennepin County prosecutor, the former Hennepin County prosecutor is a woman named Amy Klobuchar, who is a Minnesota senator now and has officially gone into the deep vetting to be the running mate for Joe Biden. Turns out we learned yesterday that there were previous complaints against the officer who had the knee on the neck of George Floyd. Based on the reports I've seen, anywhere from a dozen to about 18 over this guy's 19-year career. And obviously the complaints aren't identical to this. A lot of different incidents going on. But ultimately, he never faced prosecution, and I don't believe, other than maybe one slap on the wrist, was ever reprimanded for his conduct. Amy Klobuchar apparently refusing or declining to prosecute on a couple of occasions when I guess she could have, and a lot of people are assuming now that this means her chances of being the running mate are done. Is that how you see it?
Well, on the one hand, if you feel like Amy Klobuchar is the best choice to be president, if God forbid something happens to Joe Biden, best person to be vice president and a key member of that administration, best person who can help you win, then I think you make the choice and you just weathered the storm of this particular decision. I was ready to clobber, no pun intended, Amy Klobuchar over this, and I'm sure somewhere Kirby Puckett is saying, yeah, go after her. But it's okay. Seriously, so the spin from the Klobuchar staff was that she was not the prosecutor when this case was presented to the grand jury in 2007. That's correct enough. Now, if you want to look at it, October 27, 2006 was the date of this shooting for Officer Chauvin, the death of Wayne Reyes at the Latino Man. By the way, this is I believe it was a car theft or something. So this was not necessarily a officer pulls out his gun and shoots a guy for no reason sort of circumstance. Now, on the official records, it says Klobuchar was county attorney until January 3rd. That's when she resigned her office to become in the U.S. Senate. Subsequently, I've seen people saying, well, actually, December 30th was her last day in the office. Obviously, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, you're probably not going to be in the office. So it may well have turned out very conveniently for Amy Klobuchar that she was out of the office, before the window of what the prosecutorial decisions of what are we going to do about this police shooting was fully resolved. I think you could probably fairly argue, and I suspect people who don't want to see Amy Klobuchar be Biden's running mate are going to say, oh, if she thought there was anything wrong with this shooting on October 27th, yes, of course, she's running for Senate at that point. I think she was pretty heavily favored election day 2006. Yes. She could have gotten the ball rolling on an investigation of this. And more broadly, there were criticisms that Amy Klobuchar was not really interested in prosecuting police officers for misconduct during her time as Hennepin County prosecutor. But, I don't think this will be a major factor, but I think anybody who doesn't want Amy Klobuchar is going to try to blur that line and say, oh, she could have gone after this guy if she wanted to and chose not to.
We're also learning that George Floyd, the cops were called in because he was trying to allegedly pass a bogus 20. When you're not resisting arrest, I'm not sure taking a guy down to the ground is required for passing a bogus 20, but not a police officer. But
Garner was selling illegal cigarettes, or was selling cigarettes without a license. So it's opening up a pack and selling them one by one. I think I'd like to believe black and white, left and right, all across the political spectrum, all across. Most Americans would say no one should die for that. No one should die for using a counterfeit 20. These are not capital crimes. I am kind of struck by the fact that some people who kind of feel like, this was, the idea that that police brutality can be justified because of the existence of violent criminals, because not every criminal is violent.
All right, well, let's move on to our third bad martini now, Jim. And as all of this was devolving in Minneapolis last night, at 12:53 a.m., President Trump decides to tweet two different things. Same message. It spans two tweets. I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city, Minneapolis. A total lack of leadership. Either the very weak radical left mayor, Jacob Frey, get his act together and bring the city under control, or I will send in the National Guard and get the job done right. Then his second tweet, which follows the same message, these thugs, all caps, are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty and we will assume control, but when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you. And Mayor Frey obviously wasn't very happy with that. He fired back and said President Trump doesn't know the strength of Minneapolis. The thing getting more attention is that second half of the tweet got flagged by Twitter again, saying this tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter has determined that it may be in the public's interest for the tweet to remain accessible, and then a link to learn more. Well, this, of course, happens on the same day that President Trump issues an executive order looking to remove immunity protections for Twitter and other social media who he deems act less like a platform and more like a publisher, showing bias and so forth. And so they're violating Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And so, Jim, this has led to a major debate on left and right. It seems like folks are kind of switching sides depending on which president is exploring this idea. But the president thinks that this is the proper response to his tweets and others that he likes getting flagged or blocked by Twitter. And then now, of course, this debate is injecting itself into a very sensitive situation in Minneapolis. So combustible, to say the least, on multiple fronts. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, once again, we have a situation where every response makes the situation worse. Twitter clearly decided to jump into the idea of policing Trump's tweets because of his tweets about Joe Scarborough. They're doing it in a pretty clumsy and ham-handed way. Somebody pointed out that the Twitter fact check that they did about the original, allegations of voter fraud through mail ballots had an error in it. So the fact checkers were actually wrong in this particular case, not necessarily about, in what Trump was saying, but they said certain states were they conflated basically sending a ballot to everyone, which some states do. Some states are entirely vote by mail, and other states which allow vote by mail for absentee voting, which is actually pretty common in most states. Trump has decided he's going to go to war with Twitter, and he's decided we're going to enforce this Section 230 and to basically make the argument that Twitter is now, theoretically, they could be liable for what is posted on their platform. The idea being like, they're like the New York Times. They are deciding what is published. They are responsible, and thus they should be held accountable. And the whole argument for Twitter for all these years was like, no. We are not the ones who are putting what's up there. We can't be held responsible for that. We are effectively running the bathroom stall wall that people choose to write what they choose to, and that they are the ones who can only be held legally responsible for what gets posted on that. It's very odd to see folks like Ted Cruz jumping on board. My colleague Charlie Cook, basically, two guys who you don't often see in vehement disagreement on this. As I see this is basically trying to argue, completely change the rules that have been in effect for platforms like Twitter and also, by the way, Facebook and basically every other publication as well, that I don't think really works here. But, the president is angry at Twitter, so he's going to lash out in this. Twitter has now responded on this. Glorifying violence. Greg, wouldn't that apply to any argument that suggests the rioting is justified?
I suppose so.
Once we get into glorifying violence, I mean, don't action movies glorify violence? Is it, the NFL's greatest hard hits justify violence? There are a lot of things that go on Twitter that could be characterized as just, glorifying violence. Now, should the president have said when the looting starts, the shooting starts? Hell no. And it strikes me, I know people say, oh, it was a saying back in the 60s. Okay, we don't want cops shooting more people. That's not how this situation calms down. That's not how this situation gets better. Do people have a right to defend themselves? Absolutely. Do people have a right to defend their property? Sure. But do we want, if the police or anybody else is going to use deadly force, then there had better be a life at stake, right? If you see an arsonist who's trying to set fire to a daycare center, Heck yes. You got to use deadly force, and you got to use deadly force. Somebody burning an empty building, I'm not so sure you're justified in just shooting that. Now, if it's an empty building that has a lot of, turpentine, and it's right next to a daycare center, well, it depends on the circumstances. But there's this really creepy, weird glee at the thought of greater violence against the rioters. Nothing wrong with being angry at rioters, being, furious with them, in fact. They, of course, they need to be deterred. Of course, they need to be stopped. Of course, they need to be arrested and prosecuted. But you don't do this by opening fire. And the idea that anybody thinks that more gunfire in Minneapolis is going to solve the problem, I think they're sadly mistaken. And I think this is, there's just a certain mentality at work here that is almost an enthusiasm for pouring gasoline on the flames.
Absolutely right. And it's interesting to watch people have different positions on this issue depending on the different circumstances. I remember either someone in the Obama administration or maybe Obama himself suggested that Section 230 wasn't a good thing when folks were obviously tweeting things very negatively about him, and conservatives were obviously upset about the free speech implications. Now President Trump is doing this, and you've got Democrats saying, well, this is infringement on free speech, when somebody dug up a video of Joe Biden in this campaign arguing for the repeal of Section 230 before this actually happened. So strange bedfellows. And you mentioned NFL's biggest hits. Remember, I think it was Monday Night Countdown used to have a section called Jacked Up until the concussions became a big issue. And then all of a sudden that mysteriously went away, and concussion discussion became a huge part of their NFL coverage. It's amazing how quickly people can change sides.
Yeah. I mean, look, at the heart of it, both Twitter and the president are defending a very important principle. And that very important principle is that what they say should always be protected by the First Amendment, or speech that they like should always be protected by the First Amendment. But speech that they don't like should always be suppressed and stifled, and, done everything they can to make sure no one ever gets a chance to see it.
Consistency. We love consistency. All right. Well, it was a banner night for law enforcement in Minneapolis as they just kind of ceded the neighborhood to the looters and the arsonists and so forth. But the police did show up, the state police, early this morning, while CNN was still reporting and the neighborhood had pretty much cleared out. Omar Jimenez is the CNN correspondent, and he was standing there in the neighborhood as the state police made its way down the street, trying to make sure that the last of the protesters had been cleared out. This whole exchange took over 6 minutes as the state police arrested him, his producer, and his cameraman. I assume the whole 4-man crew that's mentioned there, while they were live on air. We can't play the whole thing, obviously, but here's a montage of some of the more critical moments.
We can move back to where you'd like here. We are live on the air at the moment. This is the 4 of us. We are one team. Put us back where you want us. We are getting out of your way, so just let us know. Wherever you'd want us, we will go. We are just getting out of your way when you're advancing through the intersection. So just let us know, and we got you. I'm sorry?
You're under arrest.
Okay. Do you mind telling me why I'm under arrest, sir? Why am I under arrest, sir?
Officer's with CNN, and he's on the air right now.
Okay.
You are arresting him live on CNN. We told you before that we are with CNN.
So, Jim, they stayed in custody for a little while, then they were released. Once they found out that these people were actually of the media, although you could hear right there, we're with CNN, we're on the air, we're journalists, all 4 of us are with this team. And the Minnesota State Patrol says this in their tweet, which you put out also. In the course of clearing the streets and restoring order at Lake Street and Snelling Avenue, 4 people were arrested by state patrol troopers, including 3 members of a CNN crew. The 3 were released once they were confirmed to be members of the media. Governor Tim Walz later apologized. Jim, I know there's a lot on edge, but if you watch the conversation, it's pretty hard to understand how it wasn't really clear what was happening here.
Yeah, because there's no indication of what he's being arrested and detained for. They ask several times. This is not a case of the reporter. Look, this was not Jim Acosta freaking out at a White House press conference. This was not, anything that could be, characterized as out of control or potentially dangerous or anything like that, or even combative with the officers. And the claim, but I think there are a couple things that are frustrating. We talked about the prosecutor earlier, and by the way, I'm being told as we are taping, Greg, that apparently the officer has been taken into custody, which would be a pretty significant development there. But in this case, here we have, they're broadcasting live, like the whole country is watching. And the argument, I guess, in this subsequent statement from the Minnesota State Police is that there was no possible way for them to verify on scene that the camera crew and correspondent who were broadcasting live on CNN were an actual CNN camera crew and correspondent. So I guess the idea is that they think that some sort of looters or rioters just decided to disguise themselves as a CNN camera crew. They happened to get professional-grade television cameras and remote relay equipment and faked press pass and all these other things that, it's a really elaborate disguise. And secretly they're running around doing something terrible and all that stuff. And I'm sitting there thinking, but the other is that there's a considerable amount of police in riot gear all standing around. There's no indication that any one of those cops thinks this is a bad idea. There's no indication, that the reporter is asking, am I being arrested? What am I being arrested for? And there's no answer from any of the cops whatsoever. So either the cops basically believe that they've caught 3 members of Ocean's 11 in an elaborate disguise because they're going to rob the state loot fisk depository or something like that, or they're just used to doing whatever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, in any circumstances, and not having any serious consequences, even when they're literally being broadcast live on national television with the whole country watching. It is really unnerving to believe that police could be that dense, that unaware of what's going on, and just generally, it's like at this point there is still no explanation as to why they were arrested, and the only the only one that really makes that much sense is these guys were annoyed by the fact that there was a CNN camera crew there and just decided to detain them because they felt like they could. And, much to their chagrin, they're going to find out that everything they were doing was being broadcast live at that time.
Well, just to follow up on what you reported there, Jim, that Derek Chauvin, the officer with the knee on the neck of George Floyd, has been arrested in the case of George Floyd. And then your colleague, Dan McLaughlin, tweets this out. So to summarize, we have the cops fired and denounced by every level of government and investigated by the FBI within a day, arrest by the end of the week. This is, by the standards of American justice, an astoundingly rapid response. But hey, maybe there are still TVs left to target. So there's that angle as we go into the weekend here. And hopefully this news will make things a whole lot calmer by tonight.
No matter how bad things get, Greg, there's always somebody out there who's convinced they can get a new flat screen TV out of it all.
And some of them did. But Jim, if we've ever needed a break, today's the day. Hopefully the SpaceX flight gives us some good news tomorrow, and we will reconvene on Monday. See you then.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Please subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a kind review. And don't forget, you can get us on those home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. And join us Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.